Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me to speak. I'm Rebecca Willis and I'm a professor in practice at Lancaster University. My work looks at how to respond to climate change. So essentially, who needs to do what if we're going to tackle the climate emergency? And I particularly look at what government, both local government and national government, needs to do. So I'm going to cover essentially two things this evening. Firstly, I'm going to look at who needs to act. Who needs to do what, and secondly, I'm going to look at what they need to do, what actual ways there are of achieving change. So let me start with the who, and I find the best way to think about this is as a sort of triangle. So the different people who can act on climate change are government, so either local or national or both. Then you also have organisations, including businesses and community organisations and other organisations. And then you also have us all as individuals. What we do in our own lives at home and at work. So you have these three groups, and essentially any of those, anyone can take action. So as an individual, you can decide that you want to take action to reduce your carbon footprint. Any business or other organisation can do that, and there are some things that government can do as well. But when this works best is when all three sides of this triangle are working together. So let me give you an example. If you want to reduce the amount of carbon that's being used for transport in a city, so let's take Lancaster. So you might decide as an individual that, having learned about climate change, you want to take action, and you might decide that you don't want to drive to work, you want to get a bus. So that's great, you might be able to do that, or you might not be able to do that, because you might live in a rural area where there's only a bus, once a week in some cases. So you could get a bus, you could decide to switch to an electric vehicle. But if you decide to switch to an electric vehicle, it might be that it's more expensive than a petrol car, or you have problems with charging. So if you actually want, as an individual, to make some of these changes, you're going to need these other parts of the triangle to work with you on that. So the kind of thing that businesses can do is to provide bus services. They might provide bike hire, or even e-bike hire. And that would make it easier for you to travel in a low-carbon way. They might even provide electric taxis instead of petrol and diesel taxis. Government can play its part as well. So there might be a business who decides, right, what we really want to do is better bus services, but actually bus services are often paid for, at least in part, by government, by local government. So you might want local government to subsidise bus services to make them cheaper. You might want government to provide cycle lanes so that it's easier and safer to get around. So when this works best is when all three sides of the triangle are working together. So you decide that you want to cycle more. You can find a business that can help you with that cycling by selling you a bike or providing you with bike hire. And government's made it easier to do the right thing by the way that it works. So essentially, each of the sides of the triangle could act without each other, but it's much better when you align all three. And if you look at what's happened on transport, especially in big cities like London and Birmingham is another good example. You'll see action on low carbon transport by all three, and when they're working together you get a kind of virtuous circle. It becomes more likely that the three will join up, and you will get more low carbon travel as a result, because it's easier for individuals, businesses see a market for it, and government helps along the way and makes it easier and cheaper to do the right thing. So that's who can be involved in terms of the different groups. And then we've got the question of how. So what kinds of ways can these different organisations help to bring about change? So I have a box of tricks of all the things that different groups can do. I'll put it here away from the microphone. The first way that you can influence on climate change is to provide information or advice, essentially to just tell people what they could be doing. So here's an example. It is a cigarette packet, and as you will now know, there's a lot of information on cigarette packets which tell you why it's not really a good idea for your health to smoke. And they've got more and more graphic over time, but that's an example of information provided by government, giving you information that you can use to then affect your decisions in terms of what you buy or what you do yourself. Another kind of information, and this is an example that Pete told me about, which is a really nice one, is more a sort of campaign approach. So you'll see here, you might want to pass this round, but this is basically a dog poo tree, and it's where a local group decided that they were upset about the amount of dog poo that was on the path, and especially people leaving bags of it around, and so they made a dog poo tree, which was a very visual illustration of what was going wrong, and what people and their dogs were leaving behind. So that's a more sort of creative way of using information, but it's still essentially information. So I'll pass that round. The good thing about information and advice and campaigns like this is that it's quite cheap. It doesn't cost very much to communicate in this way, and it's not forcing anyone to do anything. It's just giving you the information and then you decide. But the downside of that is related. It is that it can be ignored. And if people don't have enough information about climate change, or they choose not to listen, then there's no forcing involved. You can't tell them what to do. You can only provide information and hope that people act on it. It also, in terms of the triangle of change, it doesn't necessarily work that well if you give people a lot of information, for example, on why they should be using bus services or why they shouldn't be driving as much, but you don't provide the alternatives. Then it's problematic, because you've given people information about the problem, but you haven't made them able to solve it for themselves. So that's information, that's the first thing. The second thing is something that government does a lot of, and it is buying things, essentially spending an investment. You can see I've been raiding my kids' toys for this is Monopoly money. But essentially, government or maybe other organisations can just pay for things. So an example here is cycle lanes or maybe free bus services, where government just decides that because it's the right thing to do, they're going to pay for it. So that's really effective, because if it's government money, then it's government tackling the problem directly, and it benefits everyone. So if there are free bus services in Lancaster, anyone can hop on, and it benefits them. You don't need to pay. It's quite fair from that point of view. There's two obvious downsides. The first is that money has to come from somewhere, and if it's government money, there are two places it can come from. The first is tax. So we pay for it. We don't pay when we get on the bus, but we pay for our taxes. We pay for it through our taxes in a different way. The other way it can come is from government borrowing money to invest in things like cycleways or train services. But again, if government borrows money, it has to pay it back eventually. So it can't get this stuff for free. But that is one thing that can be done. I would say at the moment there's been a lot of research which shows that most government spending actually gets spent on high carbon things like road building or airports, rather than low carbon things. So at the moment, the government spending thing is actually in exactly the wrong direction. The third thing that you can do is provide incentives, and here's my carrot. So the carrot thing comes originally from people trying to think about how to make a donkey do what it wants, and there's two ways of getting a donkey to do what it wants, apparently. The first is to persuade it through dangling a carrot in front of its nose. We're a bit more sophisticated than donkeys, but we still do respond to incentives. Basically, an incentive is where you make it cheaper or easier to be low carbon. This is something that government can do. It's also something that businesses and other organisations can do. So an example is, you'll have seen now that if you bring your own coffee cup into quite a few of the coffee chains, they will give you a discount for using your own cup. It's, you know, anything from, I think, 10p to 50p or something. And there is actually an incentive to do that, and you save money and feel like you've done the right thing. So that's an incentive. Another example is that at the moment there's no duty, there's no tax on electric vehicles. So when you get a tax disc for an electric vehicle, it's free. If you have a petrol or diesel car, then it's more expensive. So that's government providing a carrot. I feel a bit daft holding a carrot. I have to put it down in a minute. So that's ways that, you know, that's a way that government can do that. So the advantage of this is that it provides a reward for people doing the right thing, and it makes it cheaper to do the right thing. So, you know, it makes it cheaper, for example, to switch to an electric vehicle. The disadvantage is that not everyone will respond, particularly if it's a financial incentive. If you're rich enough that you don't care, and you don't care about what you're spending, then, you know, you can buy as many disposable cups as you want, or you can buy the most polluting car that you want, and no one will stop you because you just pay your way out of it, essentially. The other problem is, again, as with information, it only really works if there are alternatives. So you can provide incentives for people to get on their bike, but if you feel that it's not safe on the streets because there's no cycle lanes, then people won't take it up. So those are your incentives. And then there's essentially the flip side of incentives. There's the carrot, if you want the donkey to behave. There's also a stick that you can beat the donkey with if it doesn't behave. And so carrots and sticks are your two sort of twin approaches, and they're quite closely linked. You're having a go there. Would you like the sticks? So basically, a stick is a penalty is when you're making it harder to be, or more expensive to be, high carbon. And an example of this is taxes on cigarettes. You're making it much more expensive. Most of the cost now of a packet of cigarettes is in the tax. And that is because government is trying to discourage smoking. Another example is fuel tax, where fuel tax has been used in the past as a way of making it more expensive to drive petrol and diesel vehicles, and that's something that government might consider if they want to shift to electric vehicles. So the advantage of the stick is firstly that it raises money. So you can fuel duty at the moment provides a lot of money for the taxpayer, for the government, sorry, which can be spent on the NHS and so on. Another advantage is that it makes doing the right thing look cheaper in comparison. So it's the flip side of the carrot, if you like. The downside of penalties might be that it is a stick. It might be unpopular. The behaviour that you're trying to discourage, people might actually might actually want to drive their big car or whatever, and they might not vote for you if you're too hard with your stick, especially if there aren't any alternatives in place. And lastly, you can just regulate. And here's my policewoman, actually. You can just make it illegal to do the thing to do the high carbon thing. So an example of this is government changed the law on light bulbs, small but still significant. So the most energy hungry light bulbs were outlawed, and shops weren't allowed to sell them, and you just can't buy them anymore. And so there's lots of ways in which you can use regulations to just rule out the thing which is highest carbon. that has the benefit of being very simple and straightforward. You just say, right, you can't do this anymore, it's illegal, the police will be after you if you do. So the advantage of that is that it's simple, and it also applies across the board. So, you know, if you were to ban the most polluting vehicles, for example, then however rich you were, you wouldn't be able to drive them. It would just apply the same to everybody. But the downside is that it might, again, as with the stick, it might be unpopular. Again, if you don't provide an alternative, it might be unpopular and people might not vote for it. And also there tends to be a lot of businesses who don't want regulation to be introduced because it would affect the way their businesses work and they might lose money over it. So you tend to find that when regulations are being suggested, then a lot of businesses in particular will really resist those because they're worried about their profit margins. So that is my whistle-stop tour through the 5 ways that you can affect change. There are others as well, but those are the main ones.